Hello, I'm Sarrah Christensen. Thank you for joining me today at EA Zoom meetings. I am going to be talking about Mars in Aries, the direct and the retrograde square transiting the Pluto and Jupiter in Capricorn. And so you can contact me at my website or on social media at One Sage's View. There's my information if you need it. So to start off with, I like to set a little bit of the stage of information, kind of starting off with Mars moving into Aries, which occurred on June 27th, 2020. And additional kind of information for the Mars cycle while in Aries, I think is nice to have as a background as a part of this presentation. So I have the dates here. So if you're taking notes, you can um, gather that information to consider for this entire presentation. So Mars stationed retrograde September 9th, 2020, and then it stations direct coming up here in a couple weeks on November 13th. And then it will eventually leave Aries on January 6th of 2021. And so as we look at the Aries ingress, or the Mars ingress, excuse me, into Aries, we can kind of get a snapshot of the landscape of all the planets at that moment. And at that moment, Saturn was also in Aquarius. It had gone into retrograde just before that. And of course, earlier on in the year, we had the major transit where Saturn made a conjunction with Pluto in Capricorn on January 12th of 2020. And that should be something that's in the background of this particular year because it's so significant. So I want to share this as we start off because we can kind of see in this chart Jupiter and Pluto at 24 of Capricorn at the moment that Mars is making its entry into Aries. Also, this year we have the Jupiter and Pluto in Capricorn making conjunctions more than once. So these are the dates for that. And my entire charts are created from Solar Fire with using Washington, D.C. As the city location. And so these are the times with respect to that for the conjunctions of Jupiter and Pluto. And so we can see this is the first chart, the April 4th one to, I believe, but it seems that, no, this is the chart of the Mars, excuse me, at that moment. But these are the three conjunctions of Jupiter and Pluto in Capricorn, April 4th, 2020, June 30th, 2020, and coming up again on November 12th, 2020. So November 12th and November 13th are significant for the Mars in square. So in the beginning, before we got into Mars entry into Aries, I took a snapshot as we started off with information coming from an individual, actually a 17-year-old built this website that's tracking the pandemic. And I thought it was interesting because it was kind of like the information before that began. And I wanted to kind of get a snapshot because I'm talking about this later in the presentation. And these numbers, of course, grew significantly to the present moment. So I wanted to make note of that because I did take these snapshots back in March. So at the beginning of a cycle, before I talk about a square, I like to talk about the beginning of a cycle. And the beginning of the Mars Jupiter cycle is when they started a new synodic cycle on March 20th, 2020. And that was at 7:04 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time in Washington, D.C. is where this chart is created. And immediately we can see the pileup in Capricorn and Mars conjuncting the Jupiter at the 22 degrees. And that was the degree that Saturn and Pluto made their conjunction in January on the 12th. And so that degree was is already very hot for the rest of the year, for actually quite a bit of time, given how significant Saturn and Pluto are in their weight and how they dominate the charts because of the time it takes them to make a complete a return around the sun. So here we see that Mars and Jupiter starting off the cycle are starting off in a very sensitive degree as it is. And so we would expect to see the themes that are also carrying over from the Saturn and the Pluto to be carried over into the Mars and Jupiter cycle. So I think that was pretty significant, and wanted to point that out in this chart of the beginning of the cycle before we get to um, the square. There were some dates of, I kind of looked at specific events that were happening across, especially the US, but also across the world. Some of my examples are also from world news. But in March, when they began their cycle, I gathered probably a half a dozen news story headlines that speak to, just the COVID death toll, and at that point in time we were kind of getting news out of Italy and what they were dealing with in terms of this moment in time. California going in quarantine, stay-at-home orders for over 40 million people. The New York mayor calling on Trump to mobilize the military aid to, just the overwhelmed hospitals. And this was all happening in March. Unemployment was skyrocketing as that was taking hold across the United States, but also probably in other places of the world. As well as Greenland lost a record 6 billion tons of ice in 2019. That was one of the headlines, and I thought that was pretty significant because of new cycles and this kind of information of all this really significant transformation and change happening in the world. And so I think it's important to understand that this is the beginning of the cycle, and then it's going to grow to like what is the square, what the 90-degree, the tension that happens in the moment of crisis. Entering into the new cycle, there is absolutely, the crisis is already there. We can see it, and it's just going to get bigger. So, and really significant in the Capricorn themes and the restrictions, but also how Mars in Capricorn, about how leaders may handle strategies to deal with what's coming. And we absolutely have seen that over the course of several months. We are now in October, and we can kind of see these themes that have played out, but they will continue to play out because we're still working through this cycle. Mars conjunct the Pluto, their new cycle happened only 3 days later on March 23rd, and that is also similar. So these are like hand in hand going together in their themes. It's just the Pluto part of it is it's time for transformation at the deepest of levels in all the things that we would categorize things of Capricorn nature that are symbolized by that: leadership, authority, our systems, how they work, and what doesn't work will be very much revealed during this kind of crisis that's going to turn on in this cycle as it moves toward the square. We see a lot of that taking place in places like New York and cities who quickly had to, and Washington State and California, but it really was growing in how quickly they had to handle a crisis situation, and which leaders of the states were handling certain things related to this crisis moment. So this is the beginning. This is just the beginning as that stage is set. And this graphic that was shared on social media was produced on March 25th. I think I received it the next day on March 26th. And it's just the beginnings, as the numbers were projected to go over the coming month, 100 days from the first cases. And we're already past that number now, but this is what they were projecting back then in March. And so they're preparing for, what that could look like in our governments, which is the Capricorn, the leaders, and how they are trying to move quickly, but also some who did not take it as seriously as for how they looked at something. So the handling of um, leadership, it can be seen across many, from the United States, state by state, but also across the world. Different governments have handled this in different ways, and have had some with greater success, some about the same as the United States of America. So we jump from the beginning cycle to the first square. And the first square happens on August 4th. And on that day, we had a huge moment happening for Beirut in Lebanon, with the huge blast that happened. And so this was the after effect of that moment. And here's this first square chart. So that was just one story that day, and it was probably the most significant, I think. But I also recognize that the chart for Lebanon had Capricorn rising, so the Jupiter and the Pluto were sitting right on that ascendant for Beirut. And so I think that's pretty significant in this, and maybe why that was such a volatile place on Earth at the moment. And here is the square. Now, this is the waxing square. It is the first square, August 4th, 2020, and 9:06 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time in DC, Washington, DC. And it's really, we're at the 19 degrees of Aries, 44 minutes with the Mars, and there's Jupiter square in its retrograde cycle. And that's really significant. Other details that happened on August 4th, let's see here, I've got quite a few here, but I think it's important to weigh in on that major event that happened in Beirut, because you can easily find that chart online. But it's also that the themes that were being, trickling to the top is most probably the most significant for that moment in time. Our President Trump of the United States, there was headlines that were noting his company was being investigated for possible fraud per a filing. And so that was really significant, the Beirut explosion, but also there was quite a few comments, or excuse me, news articles or opinion pieces that were about why the pandemic is so bad in the United States. So that to me languaged in a way the crisis moment of the square, the opening square. What's interesting though is that this square is just the first one. So we're actually getting 3 hits of this particular opening square. So 3 times the crisis, handling of the crisis. And then we had also at that same time on August 4th, some positive news, support for human trafficking survivors. Trump giving $35 million to them, and so that was significant news as well. And it kind of goes with the theme of individuals and a leadership helping individuals with that have been who have been victimized. And so that would be a positive news story in that mix. So it doesn't always mean the most difficult or most challenging or violent or explosive type of thing. It can be that there's courage that is taken as a leader to do the right thing as well. So I think that's important to point out. So the next, let's see here, the next one we have are a few other new headlines that I pulled. I think most of these are from Democracy Now! Website, democracy.org. Democracynow.org. This is also really at that time the nation was still getting kind of the after effect of George Floyd's death in Minneapolis, and the video was leaked on that day. So then we can see the violence and how that would play out as well. So you can see kind of the crisis in more than one theme happening at that particular moment, and then information being revealed as well. And of course, there were numerous stories of other um, police department incidents where they were shooting peaceful protesters, but this one made the news as well at that on that day, on August 4th, when the square was. So it's revealing the theme of the police brutality and really the need for leadership and how we train our officers or police officers in the United States, especially. So the Mars square Pluto just a few days later on August 13th, and we're going to see the same themes happening with this, but maybe in a more, maybe something being brought up from that's not been visible, but there were so many stories to try to navigate these squares. It was I gathered so many, it was hard to pick and choose which ones. I mean, because it's all happening so much, so fast, so quickly, and in a crisis phase of leadership and the how someone acts and behaves. That's kind of the Mars in action. Is it acting in courage, or is it acting in fear, or is it troubled because of the lack of something, lack of training, lack of information, the quality of information, and all of these, and how you can see the variables in the leadership as what from the Capricorn perspective. So there's really like a real visceral experience with this when you're taking a look at the chart and when the first square and what that kind of symbolizes across the collective when we look at these events that are happening and how that's playing out for us. Now, each of us individually have a chart that will pick this up, the squares based on what our own personal charts are. And then we'll have our own personal experiences related to that. And there'll be a wide spectrum of what people will experience, of course, based on where they are in their growth and consciousness. Some of the headlines for October 19th, because October 19th is the second hit of the waxing, the opening square of Mars and square Jupiter. So I pulled a few headlines from to see what was kind of being languaged in our our collective news, and Roe versus Wade, the concerns about that in the Supreme Supreme Court, what was going on there. What's going on with the Thai students and the protest with the Bangkok rally. That was really significant. And the imagery for that is that really good. If you see a video of that, I would recommend it. Also, kind of seeing where other countries are moving beyond COVID and looking at getting it under control and regaining some of their exchange and economy. So we saw that in the news as well on October 19th. So that's the second square. So by the second square, other countries are starting to maybe iron out some of the experience in how they can work their economies with the current situation and how they have managed it and what has worked for them. But also, I think it's probably important to point out some of the politics that have been going on over the summer as well, and really picking up speed in October. There was the recent news about New York Post publishing the Hunter Biden report amid, the newsroom concerns about that and what was going on. So we kind of see that happening with the square. So what we care about in terms of what is reported on, what information we look at, and how we discern what is right to have publicly available to us. Freedom of speech is important. So I think that's part of the conversation of this first square, and what that means for us as a collective as we look at what we're going to be voting on. Some people have already voted, some people will be voting on November 3rd in the United States, and also how that ties into our values, the Pluto, because we're approaching the Pluto return. We're still a few degrees away from it, 2 degrees, but it's really kind of progressing. We haven't quite hit the nadir. So I think that's important to point these stories out because they are at the second opening square. So each of these themes are relative to what are we going to do with it to change this or recreate something as we build towards the opposition of these two planets with Mars. So right now we're just talking about the square because the square kind of presents all the crises, and so we're seeing all the crises presented as we're sitting in this moment of the squares. And so these months, from August through November, and it goes into December and so forth. I have some more dates on this, but the opening square is what this is all about. So there's the actual chart, and we see not only at the square that we have Mars at 19, Jupiter at 19 for this particular, those two, but we also see that Pluto has returned at 2020 or 22 degrees and Saturn back in Capricorn is emphasizing that the Capricorn responsibility, the restrictions and the authority figure and the power that is being yielded and trying to create something with it, like make it stick as well. Sun at the time of that particular square was in Libra. That was just Monday at 26 degrees. So it is square. It's just leaving a waning square from Saturn, with Saturn. And so that kind of makes it more like a T square with the Saturn as the T to that. So that brings in the Mars and Sun, Libra, and the Saturn and the Pluto and the Jupiter, even though it's the Mars and Jupiter in their exact square. In that particular moment as well, we have very strong Mercury retrograde at 9 degrees Scorpio opposite the Uranus in Taurus. And that is really significant as well for the volatility of the moment or the unexpectedness of the moment. And it does show up in the news stories for what we were looking at on Monday. And so I kind of like to look at, other stories just to kind of see what else I pulled up on that day. And that we also have the new moon, October 16th, just a couple days before this. So it's kind of like a new phase of the moon, and then this square happening within that phase. So this month from the new moon to the next new moon, we have this square kind of being emphasized for us. So it's really important to kind of consider that there's a T square here because of the sun in Libra is looking for balance or desires balance, but it has the power of Capricorn. And we see that in the news stories of what came out just recently in these news stories, how that's playing out. And some of them are like the pandemic forces 8 million Americans into poverty amid mass unemployment, and the struggle with the politics, which is Capricorn, to bring out the stimulus. And so we see a lot of stories how frustrated citizens, individuals are from their loss of employment and being in a difficult situation. And so that's this crisis moment. as well. There's also a story about the hospitalizations are on the rise across the U.S. and the cases hit 8 million. Um, and that was reported on October 16th, the day of the new moon. And so this is again going to be reflected in the crisis moment when Mars and Jupiter hit that second square. Other news that we are managing through on a daily basis is it because life is just, the chart is just reflecting life, and other things are, how um, like GOP Senator Ben Sasse, there was an article about how he says that Trump coddles the dictators and racists while profiting from presidency. I mean, these are just really like, these are like incredible news stories for this moment in time, that in 20 years when we look back on this moment, how much that we have moved through while building this presentation alone. There were so many stories, it was almost daunting trying to put together to see how much we've actually moved through in such a short period of time. The fires, of course, but one of the ones that was just recently is the Colorado, the Cameron Peak fire that hit the news on October 16th, part of this square. So our natural resources being burned up like this, and that's Mars and Aries, the dry, hot, and the land going through such transformation, and individuals and our system being hit by that, trying to manage with the resources with um, our firefighters who are dealing with that on a huge scale and pulling those resources to fight that, or manage it the best they can, because I mean it's breaking records, and that's pretty significant as well. And I know there were other fires that I'm just picking the one that was reported on the day of this, or just slightly before this square, so it was kind of moving to exactness 3 days later. The World Health Organization warns about that we might have to wait for a vaccine and until 2022, and that's really significant too. This is, again, emphasizing a bit of information about the crisis of the moment. Other ones that were prevalent on October 16th, also in the news, was the Senate on track to confirm the far-right Supreme Court nominee Amy Coney Barrett. I hope I said her name right, Barrett, on October 26th. But this news hits on October 16th, just a couple days before the exact square hits. And then, Trump refusing to disavow far-right anti-Semitic QAnon conspiracy theory stuff while in the town hall. So these are really significant in our moment of crisis. All of these, in terms of leadership, in terms of how it's really revealing how vulnerable we are as individuals and a collective and communities, and our communities based on who we have in leadership positions and how they manage such crises, moments of crises. Because we actually have examples in other parts of the world where it has had, different results, and not as much as we've had. We also are a significantly populated country, and so I think that's important to keep in mind as well. So the opening square, continuing to bring up the themes of the crisis of the moment. This was a graphic that was shared, I think, by Chris Brennan, but also by Naomi Bennett. They're both astrologers online on social media. This was shared on October 16th. It might have been shared by another source, and I don't have the original source, but it's been shared a couple of times, so I don't know who the original source is for this, and if someone knows, please let me know, because I'd like to give them credit. But this was an incredible visual of the Mars square to Saturn, Mars square Pluto, and Mars square Jupiter. So the two, the second and third peak are the Mars with the Pluto and the Jupiter, which we're talking about today. And right in the middle of the October and November timelines is where these are peaking at their intensity. And so I found that very interesting and a helpful visual for understanding the intensity of this moment. And we're building still towards November, and then we're kind of sliding. So the square has happened. The second square in the Aries and the Capricorn have happened by the Mars and the Jupiter. And then it starts to change up on that. But you can see that at the bottom of this graphic, we have the Mars in maximum retrograde, which gives the intensity because of its closeness to Earth. Okay, so Mars square Pluto, October 9th, a little bit before, 10 days before the October 19th of the Jupiter square with Mars. Also significant, this time we can see other, the Mars opposite the Sun. This is like the period of time that I would say would be the intensity as it is opposite the Sun. When it's exactly opposite the Sun, that's when it's the closest and most intense, I guess, in that perspective. But this is the second waxing opening square for the Mars and Pluto. And on that particular day of news, I pulled up a couple of news stories, and one of them is that Trump flashes out of his cabinet with calls to indict the political rivals. But I think the really big story of that moment was when we learned that the FBI, the Michigan anti-government group that plotted to kidnap the governor, Gretchen Whitmer. I hope I said her name right. But that was a huge, really huge story that hit at that time on October 9th. And part of the crisis, there's multiple themes in every single one of these stories in terms of factual information, how we handle science and how we look at leadership and how the leadership also looks at that. We're in this period where it's really hard to navigate some of the information because you have like, what's the source? Where did it come from? And so it's really adds to the crisis moment because of the lack of clarity on something, or where's the source, or where someone is getting their news information. The streams of news are different. Many of us try to find the most unbiased that we can find, but which sometimes you have to go almost to like or news organizations that have less, I guess, big dollars behind them, not the main media. You have to look for media that is investigative reporting kind of media, and not so like NPR and those kinds of, and democracynow.org, because it's it's an organization, nonprofit. So it really, I think that's surfacing more in the collective in this crisis moment, how valuable good information is. And it's definitely been a theme of the crisis of what's happening within the pandemic and the virus situation, as each state is dealing with that in different ways, in the intensity that they've experienced it in each city, in each metro. So these are all important as part of the crisis moment. I took this snapshot just on Monday, more kind of information around the background of especially in the United States. I know that these squares are happening across the globe, so there are a few international stories in here, but it's definitely really intense, I think, in the United States. And I wanted to kind of give that some time because I live in the United States and I care deeply about the people that live here. And the history of us really recognizing not that just we have a difficult situation with the current leadership and leadership administration, but there's a bigger root problem, and I think maybe the Pluto is the part that's taking us deeper to see that. And this news story on October 19th is like really addressing that, the American imperial history of the United States of America, and not really having it fully understood for the what it has created over time. And and again, other stories like Trump's relationship, one of the key one of the key persons in the scientific community that's helping us understand what's going on with coronavirus is Fauci. And so that was also in the news, as there's like this definitely Mars kind of energy attack with from leadership. So I have not looked at if we had a chart for Fauci, but he's definitely a very prominent person in the collective right now, and what his task is for us collectively. So other headlines, just the cases that are actually starting to go back up across Europe, and there's new restrictions coming in as a part of that. So that's kind of this, again, this crisis of the square. In other places on the earth, around the world, we had the good news, I think, from my perspective, the PM Jacinda Ardern, she won by a landslide in New Zealand, and she's a progressive leader which I think would be a good example. That's my opinion. Others may have other opinions, but I think having the news hit with this during the square, it makes me wonder what will bloom from that, from her leadership. So I'm very curious to see over time, to observe what she does in her role, and how maybe other leaders around the world may pick up some of the things that she has done in her country. Another headline dealing with some of the not so good Mars square to the Capricorn is as the cases surge in the United States, there's the continuation of gatherings for the political detail with people unmasked. So there's no protective. So the Mars is not in what I call the courage to do the right thing. It's kind of more malicious or not responsible to the danger that exists in that. And that's part of that square as well. So hopefully I communicated that well. So what's important, right, to recognize in this moment now, October 22nd today, 2020, and we're still in the waxing. We're in the opening square. We're in the crisis has developed to this point where what are we going to do now? And that's where we have to go from. So the next thing we are looking at will be the square that finishes it, but it finishes in Taurus and Aquarius. So the final square, still waxing, the waxing opening square, it's in Taurus and Aquarius. I think I spelled Aquarius wrong, I can't remember. What's important here is to consider the sign has switched, and so it moves from the cardinal dynamic energy to more of a fixed nature. So what has been what has progressed through the other squares, the first hit and the second hit for Mars and Jupiter, and by January 23rd, 2021, we have the next square is where things can get fixed and where it's more difficult to change, or that it's really stubborn energy. So, or it is a dynamic that is hard work. The change, there's potential of change, Mars is slowed down about what it can do, but it's more like pragmatic in the how it's approached. But it's also in the sign of Taurus, which is where it has a bit of a steadfastness to it. It's like I've heard where someone says Mars in Taurus is like someone with your foot on the brake and on the gas pedal. So all of that square the Aquarian, fixed ideas, fixed thinking, fixed ideology. So where are we going with this finishing square? It really depends on what actions were taken during the cardinal energy, October, November. So the voting really is going to be interesting to see how these will manifest. That last square will be very different depending on what that takes shape. And interesting that this square happens right after the inauguration date in the United States of America. So that's very interesting to me. But also that the moon is in Gemini. So I wonder about what is, that's a really big changing energy and tying into the sun at that moment. So the Mars square Pluto, I looked up in Planets in Transit by Rob Hand, and just read a few of the lines he had shared in that detail between the Mars and Pluto cycles. Basically, one of them that really caught my eye is, as you strive to get ahead, be careful that those in power over you do not oppose you. They are stronger now. And I like that quote because after gathering all these news stories, I couldn't help but think about Dr. Fauci and the situation he faces every day with our president and President Trump in the United States, and also each of the governors in the states and how they must manage relative to the federal, to the president. And so it's kind of interesting, given that scenario, how that works in each location and how the courage of Mars, but also the intensity of that exchange is, kind of revealed in the Mars, and then the Pluto, the power play it with all of that. I just love that quote, given everything I had just read with all the news stories. So the Mars square Pluto, the final waxing square there is December 23rd, 2020. So this one you can see is still happening in the cardinal signs. So the Mars and Jupiter in the January is in the fixed signs, but the final square of Mars Pluto happens in December. And that's right after the winter solstice. And so it's kind of interesting to see how some of these themes, how much power, what is going on with the power exchange, and to me, there's more chaos of just real sheer intensity around the power and those who oppose the power. That's the Mars in Aries. So it's really going to be interesting because just 2 days before that, Jupiter and Saturn makes ingress into Aquarius. So is there something that's happening relative to that ingress between Jupiter that plays out through something new with the Mars in the Aries? There's a possibility, but it's also the opening square. So something new can happen here, but there's still a volatility to it. There's still a power here that's going through a big changing dynamic and significant resistance with the Capricorn. So that's important to point out. Mars opposite Jupiter, that's the peak. The peak of this doesn't happen until July 29th, 2021 with Mars and Jupiter. And here's the chart for that. So this is what it's growing to. And so the crisis moment, then full blown. So what's the full bloom? What gets changed up? What is does do we make corrections to what we learned in the square of the crisis moments? How does the power change with going from the Capricorn to Aquarius? So it's kind of interesting to see that as well. So Mars opposite Jupiter, but here it's Mars and Leo, leadership. Interesting that it's 29 degrees of Leo and Aquarius. There's someone, I think the president of the United States at the moment, that's, I think their Mars, or at least their ascendant. And I think it's their ascendant. And so that's really significant. So maybe that's part of this, part of the storyline that manifests when it's in the fullness of that cycle. So that's interesting. The Mars opposite Pluto is just a couple, like 6 weeks or so before that, happening on June 5th. So Mars opposite Pluto actually is the bigger one. So maybe the storyline, you know, looks to, and I just realized that I added the wrong chart on this. My apologies. This is showing the Jupiter opposite the Mars. Should be Mars opposite Pluto. But that chart is June 5th, 2021 at 3:08 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time in Washington, D.C. So I'm sorry, I grabbed the wrong chart for that. But that is kind of just a little bit before the Mars opposite Jupiter. So I think that's significant in how everything moves to that moment. I know so many of my friends, myself, we look to the astrology to help answer the questions, but this is so incredibly big compared collectively that we have assumptions, but we don't have all the answers because it's still, because until you land in the moment, because the charts reflect the moment. We can see the archetypal themes here of power and the crisis at the squares. Pluto as the power, the intensity of the power, Jupiter making it bigger, Mars is the resistance to that or the struggle to that, speaking to, or even violence or accidents or those kinds of things, huge conflict, huge tension with the with that. And so next summer is really when this thing goes significantly into the fullness of the cycle. So that's quite a few months away, and yet the fullness of the cycle really for Mars and Jupiter is in Leo Aquarius. So leadership is also Leo, but Aquarius is more what we do collectively for each other, for the whole. And so how's that working out? There's an opposition here. And yet Saturn has moved into Aquarius. And so how does that take shape? Or does that show up? Are we going through getting some kind of vaccines at that point? There's a lot of potentials. We can see some of those things moving that way. But we'll, I'm sure, hear sometime in December more progress around that, and then how that really will flow through the collective and what it changes for us individually and in our communities. And there's the June 5th chart. I think that's the other chart actually. Then the closing squares. The closing squares happen in Mars square Jupiter, but they're in Scorpio Aquarius at the closing square, and that's at the end of next year in 2021 on December 8th. And this is so really significant in how the crisis of this moment, how we might be wrapping up things in the closing square is where other things manifest as they close out the cycle before the next cycle. So the opening square, how we deal with it, we have a peak moment with that, that's the opposition, and then as we move towards the closing square, that's when really things that we've done well will manifest, but also things that we haven't done well will also manifest and show us really where there have been holes in how we've solved certain problems or certain things. So that's going to be what we take a look at and how things are taking shape. So December 8th, 2021, the closing square begins in the sign of Scorpio, which is interesting, in Aquarius for these two planets, Mars and Jupiter. So Mars in his own sign in Scorpio can be the symbolism does carry over to pandemic and disease and things like that. But with Jupiter and Aquarius, maybe we have things to solve a problem, into the collective in new ways. And so I'm going to remain hopeful for such things under the themes of Aquarius for the collective and what we have learned as a collective, how we take care of each other and what we need to do to heal. These are important. And the Mars square Pluto waning closing square is in Libra at Capricorn. And so it's a rather dynamic closing square, October 22nd, this day next year. So it actually hits the Mars square Pluto closing before the Mars Jupiter's closing. So this is interesting. And Mars is in Libra. So is there new endeavors for peace and balance and ambassadors for that kind of with Mars next to the Sun in the Libra, or are we finding still challenges with trying to get that? It really depends on the collective making choices, and that's using their Mars and using their free will to make those choices. But there are power plays that are happening and can impact people. So of course it all is down to us looking at astrology for how we can navigate and utilize astrology to help us understand the moment and how we can strive to live as balanced as we can in kind of so many unknowns. A new cycle begins for the Mars and Jupiter when they make a conjunction on May 29th, 2022. So this cycle will close basically that day. And then they make a new conjunction in Aries. So the conjunction that started all of this was in Capricorn at the 22 degrees. Remember that was really a volatile degree to be on for the beginning of the cycle. This time it is in Aries at 3 degrees. And so a lot of something new and, kind of like spring in a big way because it's Jupiter in Aries as well. And that to me is like things that are brand new on the scene, very pioneering. And so that's something I'm excited about. It can be, if we look at it from a negative perspective, it can be volatile from that perspective. But I like to have faith in the future and look at the potential of what if certain things land, then we work to cut together progressively, especially when the Saturn and Jupiter are in Aquarius, towards something new for the collective. I really am hopeful for that, but there is also a shadow in any sign, right? But what are we dealing with right out of the gate? Social distancing and surveillance and things like that, but to what degree, right? And then what gets corrected and things like that. That's all on the table in this coming cycle. But then what comes new? What comes new in their next cycle? And that's May 29th, 2022. That's not that far off in the future. And so it's kind of interesting to look at that. And the nodes at that point are in Cancer and Capricorn, and I think they're finishing off. So let's see here. So that's important there. This is all moving towards another key important date, and that is February 20th, 2022, which is USA Pluto return, which I thought was interesting because it's so close to the point when Mars and Jupiter are conjunct and starting a new cycle. So they're basically finishing the cycle right before the Pluto USA return. And so that's pretty significant to me and what we are kind of moving towards. And we haven't quite hit the nadir. And I think that's important because there is this kind of transformation that's going on in our values. And I think this kind of, in a big way, shows all the holes in where we are in the moment as a collective group. And but I think it also, even in other places of the world, I think this has really revealed where we are strong in our collective humanity and where we have room to grow, and how we care about each other and planet Earth and how we are living with our natural world. So I wanted to point that out because I think that was interesting that they kind of are building towards that moment, and then that's a really peak moment, and then we come out of that, slowly move forward from that, and whatever that's bringing in our awareness and our consciousness as we transform our shadow experience and understanding our history and what we're, and all of that goes with it. And this crisis moment, this Aries, Mars Aries and the retrograde process that we're going in with now, but also in the direct and the square with Jupiter, we're really kind of feeling how important our systems are and our leaders and how we vote because of the suppression of the voting and how many people are lining up to vote. I mean, that's encouraging, and I think that's great. But that's really important. And then the Mars conjunct Pluto, there's a new cycle that happens March 3rd, 2022. And it's interesting that Mars conjunct Pluto cycle is happening right on the 27th degree of Capricorn. So 2022 is the Pluto return for the United States of America, and a new cycle for Mars conjunct Pluto happening after that date. And so to me, this is like, what's the rebuilding? What does that look like? And so the values, I really wonder about all of the values that we care about collectively: our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, our voting, our freedom of speech, that, all of these things. And then how we educate our children. All of these are up for reevaluation and what we're going to do about them, because this moment of crisis has pointed us in this direction to actually look at it. So that's the conclusion of my presentation for Mars in Aries, retrograde, direct and retrograde, squaring Pluto and Jupiter in Capricorn, with some other information that helps kind of understand the building of this. But right now we're still in the crisis moment, and I thank you very much. You can find me on One Sage's View online, at One Sage's View on Instagram or Facebook, and I appreciate the time today to share this with you. I did create a very long document that I will willingly share with others. I do need to make a few little edits on it to correct one of my slides. But other than that, I'm happy to share that with others. So thank you very much for the time today.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was brilliant. We'll catch you next time.